Thank you, Giovanni. Yes, and I would like to thank you, Giovanni, and Vittorio and Donatella for this invitation and this very interesting meeting about, as Donatella has said, very relevant kind of topics, but very up to date and kind of confrontation that is shaping the international economic relations since quite a while. I thought to address this kind of issue in order to talk about what is going on between US and China, and what is even more important, the kind of global context within which this kind of confrontation is taking place. Just to, first of all, just to remind us that US and China are today confronting in trade, technology, in security terms. Certainly, the Trump administration has been and is the leading actor, behind this kind of confrontation. But we should remind us that, many things were going just before Trump. So Trump is not the beginning of the story. So first of all, I would like to, introduce this topic by talking about the spectacular growth of China, and what was very important, the redistribution of power at world level that the rise of China did produce. The China own way of international integration, in other words, was a very peculiar path, quite far from the expected path, that US and Europe thought could have been followed. Why is important? Because the rise of China is the rise of a tripolar world economy. So we had this big shift from bipolar US and Europe to a tripolar China and Pacific Asia. The landscape of world economy changed. The international order that was so effective and so, in some way was able to provide stability and growth in the past, was not able anymore to provide the adequate governance to the tripolar world. That's, something that was before Trump. So when Trump entered into the scene, the global context was already, in some way reshaped by these current trends. Certainly, Trump did many things, in other words, accelerate many trends underway. So we have to talk about what is the strategic confront and conflict between the US and China that is not only about trade, but is today a geopolitical confrontation that is, very much about the future leadership of the, world economy. And very briefly, to discuss what kind of scenario is ahead. In other words, if we extrapolate the current trend, certainly it's very difficult to be optimistic about the, international relation of the future. But I just want to put on the table that this is not optimistic scenario, is not the only one, because there are other trends that in some way could produce a different kind of international scenario in the future. So that is the kind of issue that I want to cover, but of course, to remain in the 35 minutes that I was given for this presentation. First of all, something that is well known, the spectacular growth of China for at least, more than 3 decades was an incredible, spectacular growth, because it was not only very intense, but was very fast. So China was able in 3 decades to do what, other leading countries have done in 70, 80 years. In other words, the rise of China was undoubtedly, spectacular, because it was, from this point of view, able to almost, double, increase 4 times the income per capita, although, as we know, China, in terms of income per capita, is, still a not rich country, from many point of view. So China has undergone a radical economic change, but maintaining the same political organization, or even more, consolidating the centralized control of the system by the communist political party. So big economic change, big economic shift, but in political terms, not very, very, very many things did happen, Now, this is, what was the consequences of the rise of China. In other words, we had the redistribution of manufacturing and GDP shares between advanced countries, but particularly US and Europe. US and Europe have been dominating the world economy for 2 centuries, we could say, because, first was Europe, US was, catching up, and US was becoming even more stronger than Europe. But if you sum the two, we could say that for more than 2 centuries, the world economy was US plus Europe. The rest of the world economy was simply providing inputs, raw materials, money, and to the core. Industrial manufacturing investment was in US, in Europe. Japan was the only, part of something that was not in this kind of area. Now, the dominating part of share of US and Europe and Japan was drastically, challenged in the 90s with the rise of China and Asia Pacific, because as you know, China was not alone. China was part of a manufacturing platform that was, based on Asia Pacific. And you see that, this redistribution of share in terms of manufacturing and GDP has been very important. And has been very important not only in terms of product, because as, in an extremely interesting book, Baldwin was showing, there was this flow of technology that was coming from the north to the south, together with the production plant. So we had this kind of new landscape, that there was this new, tripolar world economy. How China was able to integrate into this, kind of system dominated by US and Europe. As you remember, you read, in the books, US and Europe welcomed China, the big communist country, to enter into the international economic order. The hypothesis was, if we are able to contaminate China, to involve China into this rule-based system, institutional-based system, this is going to be positively contaminate China. And what is even more important, if China, develop and become richer and richer, this is going to create, a big push toward a positive evolution of China into a market economy, so something very, more similar to Europe and US. And what was also more important, even more important, China is going to produce this kind of, new wealth, is going to produce a positive incentive at political level as well, in terms of, producing this kind of, incentive for a more democratic freedom, more democratic system. So this was the main hypothesis, If we are able to, in some way, engage China, so this positive engagement was considered a very important kind of long-run trend. Of course, the parallel, the kind of parallel way was, we are now waiting for this big transformation. In the meantime, we are going to make business, because that was undoubtedly for many years the major, kind of goal. So business first, I think, was in the end the approach. China into WTO, 2001, China transforming. But on the other hand, each country, major country, was doing bilaterally, even a European country, has no at all one European approach, a EU approach. There was German, France, much less Italy and other European countries that bilaterally were exploiting this immense domestic market of China. So that was the idea. China could become a responsible stakeholder. But China has, its own way of integrating into the international system. Undoubtedly, the benefit of integration, China integration, were real. One could mention the cheaper goods for Western consumer coming from the global value chain, the network that has been built with China. Of course, the domestic market of China meant for many Western companies, European, US companies, an incredible opportunity for business. And as we know, 100 millions of Chinese and other Asia-Pacific people have been raised from poverty. As we know, that is an astonishing result in historical terms. But on the other hand, the main hypothesis behind this integration of China did not find any kind of expected outcome. First of all, in political terms, China did not evolve at all into a more democratic political system. Quite, contrary, we had a strong consolidation of the dominance of the Communist Party, and particularly under President Xi Jinping, over the last year, we had this, strong kind of reinforcement of the position of the Communist Party. And in terms of economic trends, certainly China is not a market economy as we could define, a system like this, because first of all, the role of state company is still dominant in many sectors. The role of state or public, kind of sector is, particularly in financial, as you know, area is the predominant figure. And if we see, what is going on over the last 4 or 5 years, this role and this position of the state company has been even further consolidating. If you look the, kind of the role of the private sector and the state sector, you see that the private sector has been diminishing significantly its share in terms of the domestic economy. So from this point of view, it's very clear that, there is a kind of consolidation of this kind of trend. What is more important, very recently, China changed, drastically and radically at domestic level and international level, its growth strategy. For many years, China was an economic system based on a cost-based competition. But more recently, China entered into what is, one could define a kind of technological strengthening. In other words, from a quantitative growth, more and more China is trying to enter into what is a qualitative growth. As you know, quantitative growth is based on the quantity of capital and labor, increasing this quantity. There is a middle income trap for any country, and China is into this, addressing this middle income trap, and you have to shift into an economic growth where not more capital and labor, but better use of capital and labor, technological change, as we very roughly define this second kind of phase. China is entering into a phase where technology should be and is going to become much more important than simply a cost competitiveness base. And this is, as we know, based on this project that 2025, that is defining the next, 10 years, because it's something that is going much beyond 2025 in terms of the allowing China entering into the new high-tech area, robotics, artificial intelligence, digital technology, and so on. So this was a very big shift. Not anymore simply, based on low cost, low wage, but more and more a giant economic system that want to become a giant technological power. Secondly, for many years, we will say for decades, China trying to maintain a low profile at international level. China was in IMF, China was in WTO, China was in many international organizations, but always maintaining a very low profile, saying we want to develop domestically. We don't care. I mean, we don't want to intrude at an international level. That was for many decades this kind of low profile, the attitude at the international level. Now, this is not anymore the attitude of China. China became very assertive at an international level. And that was particularly after the 2008-2009 Great Crisis. After the Great Crisis, China has been able to mitigate, minimize the cost of the crisis, was able to grow quite immediately. And what is even more important, China, that was for many years the major receiver of FDI. FDI was a very important ingredient of economic growth in China, became a big investor. The state company, the Chinese company, and China as a kind of system became a very important source of outflow FDI. And outflow FDI in recent years have been increasing and exceed the inflow of FDI. That's what's showing that China has been changing this kind of attitude. China has been increasing its role in terms of global value chain. Here, a reconstruction of what are the major hub of global value chain. China is undoubtedly, one of the major kind of hub from this point of view. It was, another kind of evidence of the new international role of China. We had this Belt and Road Initiative that was a major initiative that we should not forget, driven personally by President Xi Jinping, presenting this, is something that was presenting as an infrastructure, kind of increased connectivity. But if you look the number of countries where this Belt and Road Initiative is, in some way involved, it's very clear that this is something more than an infrastructure project. This is something that we could, define a kind of new world order, international order, because you see, the countries are not only Asia, but, in Europe, but they are all the other part of the world, although with different share. But certainly, this is, an incredible major effort at China level in order to become not only a giant economic bloc, but a very important kind of bloc, internationalized and with this international dimension. Naturally, one should not overestimate what is going on in China. And the reason is that there are still, major challenge that China should address. And this is a list of the things that this big shift from, cost competitiveness to technological competitiveness, what one could say the middle income trap should, confront. In other words, first of all, a reorientation of economic growth, much less on investment and export, much more on domestic market and, consumption, domestic consumption. This is the major, challenge. China, as you know, was a big surplus, trade surplus country, more than around 10% of your GDP. In few years, China was able to drastically diminishing, and today is, less than 1%, or even balance the surplus. But of course, what is even more important, if you want to be a very, important technological power, the private sector should play a very important role, because technology is, very important not only in terms of producing technology, but diffusing technology. How you diffuse and adapt technology is even more important than simply producing technology. And when you, mention this adaptation and diffusion, undoubtedly, everywhere, the private sector, the private firm, the consumer are indeed, very important actors. And as we are seeing, the private sector is reducing their importance in China today. At least, looking at the last 4 or 5 years. And of course, changing from quantitative to qualitative growth means that your source of growth become innovation. You are able to grow because you are an innovative economic system. This is very simple to define, but it's very difficult, to achieve. And we could say that China is still, in a kind of a transitional phase. And of course, this is the going global is another. So I should say we should, underline the major significant change that was underway in China. But on the other hand, we should not forget the big kind of, challenge that is China is confronting today. Now, why is it important to trying to, remind us this kind of a path followed by China? Because undoubtedly, in the 90s, and particularly in the first decade of 2000, we had this big shift at the world level. The world economy, as I already said, changed from the bipolar to the world economy. What was even more important, the interdependence became much more intense and different from the past. The global value chain, the finance, has been increasing this interdependence across countries, particularly, between US and Europe and China. But on the other hand, you see here, this contribution toward GDP, China is the yellow kind of rectangular, is very clear that it doesn't matter how you measure it, the role of China is indeed very increasing. But interdependence has been increasing. But what about the integration of world economy? The capability of managing this interdependence, what we call political capability. This has not been increasing at all. In other words, the institutional rules of the Bretton Woods system, IMF, World Bank, and more lately WTO, has not been able to adapt to this new tripolar world. In other words, this kind of rules and institution very much, dominated and determined by US and Europe in the bipolar system, as finding increasing difficulties to adapt to this new kind. So we had an increasing interdependence, a lot of, but an inadequate and very low capability of managing this interdependence. That was before Trump. We should not forget. The system was under stress. You remember the Doha Round? The Doha Round was launched in 2001, was supposed to finish in 3 years, in 2004, 2005. You know, the expectation was about to have this new kind of agreement. The Doha round was a failure, a complete failure, never ended, as we know, you know. And the reason why was because of this new tripolar world. You know, US and Europe, when the Doha round started, were able to achieve a very important agreement in agriculture and the rest of the goods. Once the US and Europe, you know, did achieve this agreement, they, as they have done for, you know, in the past, presented to China and India and the rest. That is our agreement. Now, this is the new kind of Doha system. The answer of China, India, partially Brazil, was simply no. We don't want to ratify your agreement. We want something else. They never clarify what is something else, because they went on saying no. You know, first was India, after China, Brazil. The result was no agreement. So Doha round was the laboratory of this new, you know, kind of difficulty. How to manage a system where there is no anymore only euros and US, where China certainly, but even India are now, you know, much more powerful than in the past. How to manage this kind of new system? And apparently, the Doha round showing that this, you know, adaptation was indeed very difficult. So, you know, this was the story, because otherwise we think that everything is Trump. You know, Trump did everything, and now if Trump is not going to be elected, you know, everything is fine. You know, no, it's not so. Not, of course, you know, if the 2010 election is going in a certain direction, you know, I will not be, I will be very pleased. But this is another story. You know, what Trump did, of course, was something new. What an acceleration and a big acceleration in this new, you know, bilateral kind of world, because China was posing this new internet, you know, new challenge. We had this failure of the expectation of US and Europe about the change of China, you know. So it was very clear that what China was doing was an asymmetrical openness. In other words, China has, you know, a very kind of intense access to Europe and US market, but we could not say that US firm and European firms have a reciprocal kind of access. So there was an asymmetrical kind of a lack of reciprocity, if you want. That is the problem for US and Europe. But of course, you know, what Trump did was to go much beyond this kind of problems, common problems between US and Europe. So the shift was from a strategic engagement in the past, trying to contaminate China, into what is a strategic competition. In other words, trade confrontation, technological confrontation, strategic confrontation, security area that, you know, from this point of view was a very, you know, kind of escalation, a big rise of this dimension. And we know that, you know, what Trump was exploiting the kind of, you know, the kind of difficulties of the economic order of the past, and was providing a new kind of perspective in terms of this make American great again, America first. That is a kind of unilateralism, neo-mercantilism, you know, from many respects. And the idea of Trump is, of course, the starting point is a an idea that the international economic relation is a zero-sum game. Has no idea about the possibility of a value added that was in the past, a kind of basic kind of premises. Zero-sum game means that I have to, challenge you because everything that I am able to gain is what you are losing. It's a poker game, the idea behind the international economic relation of Trump. And what is even more, Trump was considering, a kind of cost, the multilateral system of the past. The idea of Trump, not today, one should say that from this point of view, Trump is changing every day or every week is a kind of, but in terms of trade relation, he was very, from this point of view, very coherent. Because 20 years ago, 10 years ago, it was repeating, US is losing in terms of, being a leading actor in the multilateral system. So I want a bilateral relation. I want a kind of system where US is the hub and the rest is an hub-spoke model. What is very important is not rules, is not procedure, is not institution, is outcome, results. That is the business approach, that when you want to make a transaction, what is very important is the result of your transaction. That is the approach that, Trump was in some way transferring to the trade and economic relations. So a transactional approach, from this point of view. What is the current world context? If we, after these 2 years of Trump therapy, we could say. First of all, it's very clear that this is a multipolar, tripolar world without any national leadership. US because doesn't want to. And China probably because it's not yet able or doesn't want to as well. So the system is, there is a lack of leaders at international level. And there are these two traps that, in the literature you find a lot of references. The first is this Thucydides trap. The idea that, China is threatening, the incumbent leader of the system, US. And from this point of view is a major threat. And this is, could degenerate into a major conflict. The idea was in the past, the confrontation between Sparta and Athens, and as we know, the outcome was indeed very, very, very dramatic. So first of all, we are in a system, there is no leader or explicit leader, and we have this kind of Thucydides trap. I mean, China is threatening the position of US, and US is in some way trying to respond in terms of confrontation. But we have another trap, that is the Kindleberger trap. As you know, Kindleberger was the economist that in a more coherent terms was defining the fact that an international economic open system, in order to function, needs a sort of stability. This stability is a public good. What Giovanni was referring before is a collective public good. Who is providing this collective public good? Now, the story is very complicated, but the idea is that the major problem of producing a collective public good is the existence of a free riding, of free riders. Country that, are able to exploit the public good, the stability of the international order, but doesn't want to contribute. So in order to avoid free riding, the structure of the system, the structure of power that is very much, in some way, the best kind of structure, or in the past has been able to show its effectiveness, is the hegemonic system. When you have an hegemon that was able, in some way, not only to provide rules and institution, but was able to provide that the rest of the system and member countries are going to respect and apply this rule and the system. Now, in this kind of a system, we have no any hegemon, we have no any leader, so the risk is that China is able to challenge, to threaten US, but is not able to provide any public collective good. So from this point of view, from this respect, is still too weak to provide something that is needed. And so this is another trap. And from this point of view, this is an unstable kind of context, because stability in monetary, financial, trade terms is something that, if you want an international multipolar system that does function, stability in terms of having this kind of structure, systemic structure, is an important ingredient. Now, the lack of this kind of systemic structure is also increasing the kind of mixture between economic factors and security or geopolitical factors. In the past, economic relations have been, quite drastically separated from politics and from security. In other words, the two systems were indeed very autonomous one to another. What we see today in the system is a kind of, increasing mix of the two. You using trade relation not only for economic reason, but because you want to impose your power, and you want to impose a certain kind of outcome. And on the other hand, in order to have certain security outcome, you're going to use your economic power. Think about US now and the Iran kind of agreement. As you know, President Trump has been, in some way, leaving the Iran nuclear agreement, and is trying to use the power of the dollar in order to impose European and others, the acceptance of this kind of new political struggle. So economic and political security relations are indeed more and more, in some way, mixed. And from this point of view, it's very clear what is the risk of this kind of trade economic world for the future. So if we extrapolate the current world context, we could say that the future scenario is indeed not at all very reassuring. There is people, that's calling this new scenario like a G0 world. Jan Bremer, that is a political, and economic strategist, has been defining G0, this system, because he's saying, yes, there are G20, G7, but in the end, no of this organization does work, and so we have this kind of system where the bilateral relation, the power relation are indeed much more important. Now, if this is the future, if you extrapolate what is going on today, we could say that we are going to see more and more the US relation with China as the kind of pillar, the core, the key area of international economic relation. And this confrontation is going to be characterized more and more by this transactional approach. So from this point of view, the future could be a future where the tension and conflict between US and China are going to increase, and we are going to see this kind of ups and downs in terms of what's happened in the last 2 years. There is a deal, no deal, yes deal, and from this point of view, every 3 months, of course, from this point of view, this is very risky because it's a kind of systemic vacuum. We know provider of public goods at the international level. What has this spillover effect upon Europe? So far not very, very positive. This is the first administration that has been, much more explicitly than any other in the past, that Europe is a competitor more than, a potential ally. From many point of view, Europe has been asked to align with the US and antagonize China, but EU doesn't share let me put it in this way. There are common kind of concern between US and Europe because, the lack of reciprocity in terms of access to China's market is something that for, US firms and US business, but it's very much the same story for Europe. But of course, EU doesn't share the Trump approach, the kind of unilateral, tariff war. So, Europe is trying to follow a different path from this point of view. Very difficult because, as you know, Trump has been showing that he's ready to impose this kind of very high tariff on the auto import, defining auto import as a security issue and matter. And of course, what is happening, in this week, the Airbus Boeing kind of story is not at all reassuring in terms of, future transatlantic relation. I think if the Trump administration is going to apply fully the 7.5 billion, new tariff, this is going to be, a kind of a strategic step, increasing the chances of a transatlantic trade war. Because you should consider that in a few months' time, the WTO is going to give Europe very much the same kind of power in terms of, imposing tariff, because Boeing has been, considered in terms of tax, in terms of public procurement. So it's indeed, one should consider, the best thing to do, trying to sit around a table and compensate or trying to find a kind of, agreement. Instead, what is going on, the Trump administration, the US administration is going to impose this new tariff. In few months, EU is forced to impose, another tariff, and the final result is going to be an increase in terms of the level of tariff. So this is showing that there is no, whatsoever kind of positive attitude toward, solving in a certain way this kind of confrontation. If this is going on, it's very clear that multilateralism could become more and more a kind of relic from the past. Does it mean that we are going to have a, kind of conflict war? I don't think so. I mean, we are going to have an oligopolistic kind of system, an oligopolistic interdependence. Major poles, showing power relation more than relation based on rules and institution. A balance of power, as we remember very well, in historical terms. Balance of power in terms of the fact that your muscle is much more important than, the kind of institution who could refer. From this point of view, it's very clear that globalization is not going to end. We could have, another phase of global economy, but of course very different from the past. A global economy where the major regional bloc are going to become, the major attractive kind of area and center. But of course, this kind of oligopolistic interdependence is going to have this downside risk. The lack of any capability of avoid a destabilization of the entire system. So this is a kind of a very risky, kind of world order. This is the kind of scenario that is just an extrapolation of what is going on today. But could we say that there is no alternative? I don't think so. I mean, I think at least we could say this is the most realistic, likely scenario from many points of view. In other words, we could, discuss if we want more or less a conflictual scenario, but certainly the trends underway are going in this direction. But we could say, and of course, this is the idea that the trade wars are no winners, because any kind of simulation of a trade war is showing that the only difference is how much you lose, but there is no winners. So the difference is different cost, but no return, from anybody. But I want also, and that is my conclusion, to put on the table something else. We could say that unless it's less realistic, there are the possibility of an alternative scenario, and a scenario where we could have a sort of different but still, quite valid cooperation among the major pool. And I think, one of the important trends underway is just the European approach to what is going on and what was going on. From this point of view, Europe has been, from this point of view, much more disappointed as much as US from China owns integration. In other words, as US was betting on China transformation, European country and EU has been doing quite the same thing. And in fact, very recently, Europe recognized that China is a major partner, but is also a very, kind of competitors, strategic competitor. So from this point of view, this was a turning point for the European Union. Not anymore recognizing that, China was the source of very great business approach, but very important, recognize the fact that you should have a kind of parallel approach, how to deal with the strategic threat deriving from China. But the approach of Europe is very different from the tariff war, unilateral tariff war of Trump. Because the approach of Europe is trying to, I would say, compete and cooperate. What's happened, after this declaration by the EU Commission that China is a strategic competitor, in April this year, we had a summit where there was this, quite acceleration of the negotiation of this investment and market access agreement between EU and China. It's a 7-year story, so, is not new. But for 7 years, we had, quite a lengthy and not so much, changing thing. Suddenly, and of course, not at all by chance, this year we had a big acceleration of trying to find major agreement, major content for this agreement. Chancellor Merkel went to China 3 or 4 weeks ago, and there was indeed the sign that Chinese government was ready to say next year, very likely in the second part of 2020, when the EU is going to be chaired by Germany, as you know that is this turning 6 months kind of presidency, there is, quite a good chance to see this agreement, a kind of deal in terms of this agreement. And this agreement is a bilateral relation between EU and China, where EU is asking more reciprocity in terms of access to market, in terms of
treatment of European firms, in terms of public procurement, and so on. It's not the end of the story, of course, but it's a major, if this agreement is going to be signed, this is a major achievement from any kind of, Western country. It could be very important if you compare, if we assume that this agreement is going to be signed, it's going to be a great kind of, if you compare the European achievement on one side, what was so far, the China-US kind of negotiation that, on the table has been showing not very much. So I would say the approach of Europe is negotiate this kind of bilateral political agreement. On the other hand, trying to use China or to cooperate with China at global level, because there is the Paris Environment Agreement, there is the WTO reform, there is certain global kind of a scale where China is looking for a kind of positive attitude, because China was undoubtedly the major beneficiary of the openness at global level, and want to maintain a kind of open system. So this is an approach, bilateral and multilateral, that if it's going to be translated into some outcome, undoubtedly is going to show that there is an alternative kind of way of dealing with China, and could under many respects contaminate positively many other countries. Of course, from this point of view, there are many things that should happen from here to the end of next year. First of all, EU should find a cohesion and unity, and we know that there are countries that in Europe that are trying to use a bilateral, kind of way. The last one was Italy signing a memorandum of understanding. It's not yet very clear what was the goal of this memorandum, because so far Italy was not able to get any concrete result. The only result was give China this emphasis about one of the 7 countries signing in a memorandum. But of course, so EU should find a unity, and secondly, China should deliver what has promised. And we know, many times it happened in the past. China have been showing, a large propensity to, but at the end, so I don't want to say that, it's already done, but certainly in showing that there is an alternative. And from this alternative, and this is my very last kind of slide, I think one could think about a possibility of relaunching a sort of cooperative attitude. Certainly, one should make very clear, the multilateralism of the past is something that is over. We cannot think to go back to the IMF, WTO, World Bank, as they did and they were. That was a bipolar world. The bipolar world doesn't exist anymore, because as we know, China is important, but Asia is going to become, an area, Pacific Asia. So we should consider that if we want to relaunch cooperation, if we want to avoid a balance of power, international world and system, we should find a new way of relaunching what we call a multilateralism in the new tripolar world. From this point of view, is a much more flexible kind of system that one should look at. We should consider that, trade arrangement and trade agreement should be, drastically modernized and also transformed. It's much more fair trade and free trade that we have to look for. And fair trade means, that trade end trade and environment, trade and labor standard are going to become indeed a very important part of the story. That is unavoidable. So we should find way of reconcile this kind of trends underway. We should give much more legitimacy to the international institution. The IMF, the World Bank, is still too much under the dominance of Europe and US. Even the story that the IMF should be a European and the World Bank president should be a US, that's a choice. This is unthinkable in a new world. That was the story 50 years ago, but could we consider, and even Europe in the IMF is represented by all the 27 countries, all the 19 countries that are part of the euro area. They have the same currency, but they are individually seated in the IMF. That is an absurdity. So we should say that for relaunching multilateralism, Europe should do, and US should do, certain kind of things. And what is, I think, indeed very important, there are some domestic issues that became very important in the past, over the past decade. Any kind of, international agreement, openness and so on, is a positive sum game, plus. But this is an algebraic sum of minus and plus, as we know in a textbook. In the past, we said a trade agreement is producing at the end a benefit, net benefit. Yes, but it's producing losers in a domestic level. What we should say to these people, don't worry, in the long run, the country are going to gain a benefit. It's not at all anymore sufficient. We should find, some kind of social safety net at the domestic level in order to respond to this kind of losers. This is my end kind of statement. I come from this experience of a political life. For 5 years I was senator. We had a certain point to ratify the CETA agreement, the agreement between EU and Canada. This agreement is the most favorable agreement for Europe and for Italy in history. In other words, if you want to compare the kind of net benefit of CETA, you will find that CETA is an incredible, positive kind of outcome. We were not able to ratify the CETA because although these losers were a minority, they are so well represented, so powerful represented. The lobby were so strong, that we were not able to ratify. So we had to put aside because, as you know, CETA is EU and national. So if you are not able to ratify national, you are going to contaminate. So it's better not to, and CETA is still there. It's not yet ratified. So it's showing that at domestic level, we should find some much more powerful and effective way of dealing with the loser than just saying, don't worry, is going to produce this net result. But certainly, a scenario where some kind of new multilateralism, although flexible, although with a variable geometry, is a scenario that we could say, although less likely than the first one, it still has chances to be realized. So particularly from the European point of view, is it very important, to look for this alternative. Thank you.